The uncomfortable question, be honest for a moment. If your paycheck stopped next month, how long would your current savings actually last? Not what you hope. Not what you assume things will become in a few years. Just based on what exists today, your bank balance, your investments, your available cash. A few months? 6 months? A year, if you're careful? For many people in their 40s and 50s, the answer is quietly uncomfortable, and it often stays unspoken. Because on the surface, life doesn't look unstable. There's a steady job. Bills are being paid on time. Maybe there's a mortgage instead of rent, which feels like progress. There's a car in the driveway, groceries in the kitchen, and perhaps even a small savings account that gives a sense of security. From the outside, nothing seems broken, but that's exactly what makes this question difficult. The problem isn't visible in daily life. It doesn't interrupt your routine. It doesn't demand attention the way a missed payment or a sudden expense would. Instead, it sits quietly in the background, building over time. Most people don't think in terms of how long would my money last without income. They think in terms of, can I manage this month? Or am I earning enough right now? And as long as the answer to those questions is yes, there's no immediate pressure to look deeper. But retirement doesn't arrive as a monthly bill you can respond to. It arrives as a phase of life where income slows down or stops completely while expenses continue. And when that moment comes, the question changes. It's no longer about whether you can manage this month. It becomes whether everything you've built so far can support the next 20 or 30 years. That's a very different calculation. What makes it more complex is that time moves quietly. There's no clear signal that says, you're now entering the final stretch, adjust your strategy. Life just continues, year after year, with small increases in income, small increases in expenses, and occasional attempts to save when possible. And because nothing feels urgent, it's easy to assume things are on track. Until one day, the timeline looks shorter than expected. The reality is, many people are not avoiding retirement planning because they don't care. They're avoiding it because the question itself feels difficult to answer. It requires clarity. It requires looking at numbers without assumptions. And sometimes it requires confronting a gap between where things are and where they need to be. So before thinking about investments, returns, or strategies, there's a simpler place to start. Just sit with the question, if income stopped, how long would your current financial position support your life as it is today? Because that answer, even if it's uncomfortable, is where real awareness begins. A familiar financial life now, consider a situation that might feel very familiar. A household in the United States or parts of Europe brings in around $5,000 a month after taxes. It's not a low income, and it's not particularly high either. It sits somewhere in the middle, stable, predictable, and enough to maintain a reasonable lifestyle. At first glance, it feels like this should be enough not just to live, but to gradually build something for the future. But when you look a little closer, the structure of that income tells a different story. Housing comes first. Around $1,800 goes toward rent or a mortgage. In some areas, it's even higher. But this number alone already takes a significant portion of monthly income. Then comes transportation. A car payment, insurance, and fuel can easily reach $600 or more. In many places, having a car isn't optional, it's part of daily life. Groceries and utilities follow. Food, electricity, water. Heating these basic needs quietly take another $900 or so, depending on location and household size. At this point, more than half the income is already committed to essentials. But the smaller expenses are where things become less visible. Insurance policies, phone plans, internet, streaming subscriptions, maintenance costs individually, they don't seem significant. Together, they often add another $300 to $400 without much thought. Then there are financial obligations from the past, credit cards that carry a balance, student loans that haven't fully disappeared, installment payments that once felt manageable. These can easily take another $500 each month. Now, without any luxury spending, the total monthly outflow reaches around $4,200. What remains is roughly $800. And this is where the assumption usually begins. That $800 looks like potential savings. It feels like progress waiting to happen. But in reality, it rarely stays untouched. Life doesn't operate in fixed numbers. There are irregular expenses, car repairs, medical visits, gifts, travel, helping family members, or simply moments where spending increases without much planning. Over time, that $800 starts to shrink. Some months it disappears entirely. So saving for retirement becomes inconsistent. It's not ignored, but it's not fixed either. Maybe $200 gets saved one month, maybe nothing the next. And because there's no immediate consequence, it feels acceptable. After all, the bills are paid, the lifestyle is maintained, there's no visible financial stress. But what's happening underneath is more subtle. The system is balanced for the present, not for the future. Income is being fully absorbed by current living costs, leaving very little space for long-term planning. And because this pattern feels normal, even responsible, it often continues for years without being questioned. That's what makes it so common. Not because people are careless with money, but because the structure itself leaves very little room to do anything different without intentional change. The hidden financial mistake at this point: nothing seems obviously wrong. Bills are being paid. There's no constant financial stress. From the outside, it looks like a stable, responsible life, which is why the real mistake often goes unnoticed. It isn't overspending in a dramatic or careless way. It's something quieter. It's the assumption that consistency alone will solve the problem. Many people believe that if they keep working, keep earning, and save a little whenever possible, things will naturally fall into place over time. And that belief feels reasonable. After all, discipline is usually rewarded in most areas of life. Show up consistently, and results follow. But retirement doesn't operate on effort. It operates on math, and this is where the gap begins to form. Let's take a simple example. If someone manages to save $300 a month, that's $3,600 a year. Over 20 years, that becomes $72,000 without considering any growth. Now, even if we assume modest investment returns, that number may grow, but not to a level that can comfortably replace decades of income. Because the real question isn't how much has been saved, it's how long that amount can sustain a life without income. If monthly living expenses in retirement are around $3,000, that's $36,000 per year. Even a relatively modest retirement period of 20 years would require about $720,000, and that's without adjusting for inflation or unexpected costs. So when you place these two numbers side by side, what is being saved versus what is actually needed, the difference becomes clear. And it's not a small difference. It's a structural gap. What makes this more complicated is that the monthly saving amount often feels reasonable in the moment. Saving $300 doesn't feel irresponsible. In fact, it feels like progress, especially within a tight budget. But the system behind it is not aligned with the outcome it's supposed to produce. It's like slowly filling a container without realizing how large that container needs to be. And because there's no immediate feedback, no warning sign that says this isn't enough, the pattern continues. Years pass, income increases slightly, expenses adjust alongside it, and saving remains inconsistent or limited. From a short-term perspective, everything feels under control. From a long-term perspective, the numbers quietly drift apart. This is why the mistake is so easy to miss. It doesn't come from a lack of discipline. It comes from relying on a system that feels stable in the present but doesn't scale to support the future. And until that difference is clearly understood, it's difficult to make any meaningful adjustment. The psychology behind it: to understand why this pattern continues for so many people, it's important to move away from numbers for a moment. Because the real reason is not financial, it is psychological. Human beings are not naturally designed to think in long time horizons. The mind is built to prioritize what feels immediate, tangible, and emotionally relevant. That's why a car payment feels more important than retirement savings. It's not just a number, it's a real monthly obligation, with real consequences if ignored. Retirement, on the other hand, is distant. It exists in theory, not in daily experience. Even if someone is 45 or 50, retirement can still feel like a separate phase of life that is not fully connected to today's decisions. So the brain naturally shifts focus toward what is urgent now. There is also another quiet psychological factor: optimism about the future. Most people assume that their situation will improve over time. Income may increase. Expenses might become easier to manage. There is often an unspoken belief that future me will handle it better. This creates a gap between present behavior and future expectations. Present decisions are made under current pressure. Future expectations are built on ideal conditions. And those two versions of reality rarely match. Then there is lifestyle adaptation. When income rises even slightly over the years, spending tends to rise with it. A slightly better home, a more comfortable car, more convenience, more subscriptions, more small upgrades that feel justified individually. None of these decisions feel excessive on their own, but together, they slowly redefine what feels normal. And once a lifestyle becomes normal, it becomes very difficult to step away from it, even if long-term goals require adjustment. There is also a psychological distance between effort and reward. Saving money requires effort today. The benefit is uncertain and far in the future. Spending money, however, provides immediate satisfaction. The brain naturally favors immediate reward over delayed reward, even when the delayed reward is objectively more important. This is not a flaw in character. It is how decision-making works under normal human conditions, which is why most people don't intentionally ignore retirement planning. They simply prioritize what feels real today over what feels abstract in the future. Over time, this creates a quiet imbalance. Not a sudden failure, but a gradual drift. A life that feels financially stable on the surface while slowly becoming less flexible in the long term. And because this process happens slowly, it rarely triggers alarm. There is no single moment where everything feels wrong, just a series of reasonable decisions that, when viewed together, lead in a different direction than intended. Understanding this is important because it shifts the focus away from blame. The issue is not lack of awareness or effort. It is the natural tendency of the human mind to favor the present over the future, even when the future matters more. The long-term impact, if this pattern continues for years, the outcome rarely arrives in a dramatic way. There is no sudden financial collapse for most people. Instead, there is something quieter and often more difficult to recognize. Retirement slowly stops feeling like a clear phase of life and starts feeling like a question, not when will I retire, but will I be able to retire at all? This shift doesn't happen overnight. It develops gradually as savings remain smaller than expected, while living costs continue to rise with time. In many cases, people reach their late 50s or early 60s and begin to reassess their situation more seriously. At that stage, the timeline is shorter and the margin for adjustment is reduced. Some people respond by lowering their expectations. Instead of a full retirement, they consider part-time work. Instead of complete financial independence, they plan for partial support from pensions or government systems. Instead of freedom, they plan for continuation just in a different form. Others delay retirement entirely, not because they want to, but because the numbers don't fully support stopping work. And for some, retirement becomes something that is constantly postponed, even when the age is technically reached. What's important to understand is that this outcome is rarely the result of one bad decision. It is the accumulation of many reasonable decisions made over time, each one small enough to feel safe in the moment. A slightly higher expense here, a missed opportunity to save there, a period of focusing more on present comfort than long-term structure. Individually, none of these decisions feels significant, but financially, time is the factor that connects them. Because money doesn't only depend on how much is earned. It depends on how long it has to grow and how long it needs to last. When retirement planning is delayed, two things happen at the same time. First, there is less time for savings to grow through compounding. Second, there is less time to adjust habits, reduce expenses, or correct the financial structure. This combination makes late adjustments more difficult, not impossible, but limited. This is why many financially stable-looking households still experience pressure later in life. Not because income was too low, but because the system was never designed with long-term withdrawal in mind. The focus remained on maintaining a lifestyle rather than building a structure that could eventually replace income. And when that transition finally arrives from earning to depending on savings, the gap becomes more visible. Not because anything suddenly changed, but because time revealed what was always there. At that point, the discussion is no longer about optimizing growth. It becomes about managing what already exists, and that difference is significant. A different way to think at this stage, it becomes clear that the problem is not simply about saving more money or finding better financial products. It is about how the entire situation is being understood. Most people approach retirement from the same direction: earn income, spend what is needed, save what is left. But financially stable individuals often reverse that thinking entirely. They start from the end, not the beginning. Instead of asking, "How much can I save this month?" they quietly ask a different question. What will my life actually cost when I stop working? That shift sounds small, but it changes everything. Because once you start thinking in terms of future expenses instead of current income, decisions become more structured. The focus is no longer on reacting to monthly cash flow. It becomes about designing a life that can continue without it. And this is where perspective matters more than intensity. Financially aware people don't necessarily live extremely frugally. They don't always earn dramatically more, but they tend to treat expenses differently. They understand that every recurring cost is not just a monthly payment, it is a long-term commitment. A slightly larger house doesn't just mean higher rent today. It means decades of higher financial pressure. A newer car is not just a comfort upgrade. It is a long-term obligation that quietly reduces flexibility. Even small, repeated expenses, subscriptions, lifestyle habits, convenience spending form patterns that define how much freedom exists later. For perspective, retirement planning is not a separate activity that begins at a certain age. It is something that is shaped continuously through everyday decisions, not in a dramatic or restrictive way, but in a consistent and intentional one. What changes is the awareness that time is the most important variable. Money can fluctuate, income can increase or decrease, markets can rise or fall, but time only moves in one direction. And because of that, every year carries more weight than it appears to at the moment. A decision made in your 40s doesn't just affect your 40s. It also affects your 60s and 70s in ways that are not immediately visible. This is why financial clarity is more important than financial optimism. Optimism assumes things will improve. Clarity accepts things as they are and plans accordingly. Neither is emotional, but only one is structurally reliable. In the end, retirement is not a single moment or a financial target. It is the result of how consistently you present. Life aligns with your future needs. And the earlier that alignment is understood, the more control remains available. Not control over outcomes, but control over direction. And sometimes, that is the only thing that actually matters. If this perspective helped you think more clearly about your situation, you can subscribe for more calm, realistic financial discussions like this.